Good morning, Vinyl community, VC members, crime stories. I'm here with my Manson book. I'm going to read a chapter called The Beginning of the End. In December 1968, Manson returned from Death Valley to Los Angeles with his rapidly growing circle in tow. After the freedom and wild beauty of the desert, the ugly concrete desolation of the city looked more unappealing than ever to him. Some of the girls, however, didn't share Charlie's enthusiasm for roughing it under the stars with scorpions, sidewinders, and overwhelming temperatures. They were glad to be back among the comforts of civilization. The difference of opinion on living arrangements gave rise to the first discordant notes in the family jam's harmony. Nevertheless, plans to build a permanent desert base were set into motion. It would be no easy, logical manner to keep the growing clan alive in the remote Barker Ranch. There were no supermarket dumpsters to raid in the desert, no ready client base for the dope deals and credit card scams that kept cash flow moving in LA. Vehicles sturdy enough for the rough terrain out there would be needed. A feverish phase of preparation for the return of nature commenced. Funds would be needed for the great exodus. Unlike many of the counterculture communes, Charlie's group never tried to become self-sustaining, a limitation that made them vulnerable to the whims of those who offered them hospitality, be it Gary Hinman, Dennis Wilson, or George Spahn. Because of this, as Charlie admitted to me, he allowed several of the girls most associated with the commune to enter the Slippy Circle for no other reason than they were willing to contribute their savings or other funds to the tribe's ever-hemorrhaging resources. Much of their other income was derived from auto theft, stolen credit cards, forged checks, and other scams. While the side of the operation was supervised by Charlie and the lesser-known ex-con associates on the fringes of the commune, the girls knowingly participated in the spirit of ripping off the establishment and giving it to the man. One more legitimate source of these needed funds, Manson had every reason to believe, would be his music. Manson was so inaccessible in the desert that he didn't know about the December 8th release of the Beach Boys single feature, the band's greatly revised version of his song Cease to Exist, as B-side until he only got back in the city. Although Dennis Wilson paid him for the compensations with the token gestures of a motorcycle and the promise of $5,000 at some nebulous future date, he guaranteed that once the Manson album proper was recorded and released, Charlie's cash problems would be solved. They worked out a more formal arrangement mañana. Fortunately for him, Manson the outlaw and perennial prisoner had little experience in the treacherous business sideshow of show business. He hadn't bothered with the legal niceties of signing any contracts for his work after July of '69, when the Wilson-Manson partnership was sundered by the Bernard Crowe shooting. Despite other monies owed for the Manson songs on the Beach Boys album 2020 would, according to Manson, have fatal consequences. After the big music biz, the New York bash at John Phillips' house, Manson told me he resumed contact with Terry Melcher and Greg Jacobson. They were glad that the erratic and elusive Discovery was back in town, meaning Charlie. The on-again, off-again plans for a Family Jam album were on again. At a stopgap, Manson rented a conventional middle-class house on Canoga Park's Gresham Street. The girls called the new pad the Yellow Submarine, drawing again to the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour. While Manson seemed to have been seriously pursuing the Wilson-Melcher promises of eminent rock stardom at this point, it's also clear that he was keeping his opinions open for keeping one foot in the underworld. The move to Gresham Street marked an end to the relatively low crime activity of '67 and '68. They needed to quickly amass finances for Manson's ambitious plans to build a well-equipped, self-sufficient desert community was at least one inspiration for this change. Within a month of moving into the Yellow Submarine, the folks next door wouldn't help but notice that their new neighbors were up to something new. A heap of stolen car parts piled in the front of the garage and on the lawn. Many of Manson's ex-con friends, looking every bit the part, were frequent and rowdy guests. A steady flow of dope dealers and dope customers came and went at all hours. Visibly underage girls in various stages of undress cavorted with the convicts. Parties were raucous. Charlie told me that several porno films were shot there, many of them sadomasochistic in nature. Sensing that it would only be a matter of time before the cops were called in to investigate, as has been the case at Dennis Wilson's house, Manson realized that the relatively secluded Spahn Ranch would be a better bet for his operation than a residential street. This decision to return to pioneer days squalor wasn't popular with all of the girls. They were just getting accustomed to having a real roof over their heads. The hairline fissures of the circle slowly cracked open. Upon the return to the Spahn Ranch, Susan Atkins began venturing out on her own. Since the February release of the White Album, now much played in the communal stereo, Sadie had dubbed herself Sexy Sadie. She turned tricks, brokered her own dope deals, and burned left clients left and right. This is where I would tend to disagree with Nick because of what happened to Susan in San Francisco 2 years before. These aggravated customers would follow her back to the ranch to wreak revenge. This forced Manson to defend her somewhat shop-warm honor. Manson became so exasperated by Atkins' recklessness and attention-getting antics that he kicked her out of the group altogether for a time. Tensions between them mounted, and even tolerant Manson started to tell the other girls that Sexy Sadie was crazy. What he didn't know at the time was that her increasing instability was exacerbated by her secret use of speed. And I can tell you that Linda Kasabian and Tex were on speed too. One of the few drugs forbidden in the circle was speed. What was worse for Manson, who still had his parole officer to think about. Think about that. He still had his officer to think about. Was that Atkins brought police attention onto herself. To get her off his hands, Manson had earlier sent Atkins to a small contingent of the girls up north in Mendocino. On June 22nd, 1968, she and Patricia Krenwinkel were arrested in Ukiah for possession of narcotics. They were accused of supplying drugs to a 17-year-old schoolboy. This indiscretion led to the Manson circle's first mention in the press as a criminal phenomenon. In reporting this incident, Sadie, Katie, meaning Patricia, and Mary, meaning Mary Brunner, were colorfully tagged as the Witches of Mendocino. By August 69, Atkins was bucked Manson's authority so often she would have been the last person he would have trusted to carry out a crime requiring the strictest confidence. The last person he would have trusted. But she went anyway, because he forced her to. Yeah, right. Speaking of which, where was Tex? Supposedly the cult leader's right-hand man at this time. While Watson occasionally dropped at the ranch, he was usually at his apartment in Hollywood, where he ran a dope on a professional scale, which Manson's more modest efforts couldn't compete with. 2 corrections to the previous edition of this book are in order here, based on what turns out to be less than immaculate research for my late acquaintance of Susan Atkins' stalker, Bill Nelson. I formally accepted the theory that Tex lived at 2024 Dracena, which was right across the apartment of Rosemary LaBianca's suspicious daughter, Suzanne Ray LaBerge. I no longer believe that this can be verified, though I still consider it possible that Watson and the other Manson affiliates knew LaBerge prior to the Waverly killings. And Suzanne's boyfriend, we're talking about Suzanne LaBerge, the strange daughter of Rosemary LaBianca. Her boyfriend at the time was Joe Dorgan, a known felon rumored to be a dope dealer attached to a motorcycle gang. It now appears that my earlier contention that Dorgan was an actual member of the Straight Satan's Biker Club was incorrect. When Manson revived the 2011 edition of this book for corrections, he admitted there was a Straight Satan's connection to the LaBianca's murders, but convincingly assured me that Dorgan was not an official Satan, and experts on the Satans with access to their membership roster also confirmed that his name was not on there. For what it's worth, Manson also claimed not to know that Rosemary Bianca had a daughter, but said that of Lino, he knew he had a son. The relationship between Suzanne and her mother, meaning the daughter of Rosemary LaBianca, according to those who knew them both, was apparently one of mutual hostility. By then, Watson was already engaged to be married to Rosina Kroner, who he would soon rip off in the Lots of Papa Burn. Are we sure we know who ripped who? Tex was only an infrequent visitor to the Spahn Ranch in this period, but as Manson became more radical in the wake of the desert epithet, several of Charlie's more conventional-minded girls began to gravitate to a money-eyed and upwardly mobile swinger Watson, who had his own criminal operation going on before he ever met Charlie. The first inklings of the Tex fraction and the Charlie clique began to take shape. If we restrict our scope to the strictly criminal side of the Manson circle in '69, we can see that the auto theft ring became a more industrious and dope dealing more prevalent. Knives and guns were carried more often as the LA dope scene began to become more perilous. But no serious violence had yet emerged, and none was contemplated. There were completely ordinary crimes, eminently pragmatic and financially motivated. Murder wasn't on the agenda. Dead bodies have a way of attracting the cops' attention that was in nobody's interest. There was certainly never any sign of outlandish pseudo-revolutionary and occult movements later superimposed on the Manson circle's best publicized violations. What Manson may have had to say about the state of the world as joints were passed around the Spahn Ranch campfire had nothing to do with the everyday business of dope dealing and petty thievery keeping his commune afloat, nor as we examine the downward spiral of bloodshed that began as early as spring of '69, we will find that the hint of the coherent training program to start a race war called Helter Skelter in the works, as mentioned, far from having a fanatical army of killers under his command when he's facing a threat to burn down the ranch, meaning Spahn Ranch, the entire ranch, burn it down, from Bernard Crow, this supposed cult leader could only get one less lethal volunteer to accompany him. Manson was far from being mastermind of this chaotic chain of events, would eventually drag him back to prison. To illuminate the infamous crime spree hidden background, we must increasingly turn our focus away from Manson. Only by directing our attention on the confounding intertwined wheelings and dealings of his partners and rivals in the Hollywood dope wars of '69 will we ever be able to direct the pattern that has been concealed. The question is, who were Manson's foes and who were his friends? The difficulty of distinguishing Confederate from competitor in this treacherous turf war was part of what led to his current predicament. That's the end of that chapter. The next chapter is called The Family versus the Family. Tex takes on the mob. I hope we keep learning from this experience. Like, share, and subscribe, and I'm 3 subscribers away from giving away the Mercy Mania record.